Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Diana Pullman, Executive Director of PANDAS Network. And joining us today is the wonderful humanitarian, Dr. Craig Shimasaki, the President and CEO of Molecular Biosciences. This is a company that has his expertise of over 35 years of biotechnology experience. And we're going to be talking today about the autoimmune brain panel. Dr. Shimasaki will explain how infections like group A strep can trigger autoimmune responses, leading to conditions like PANDAS, Sydenham, Chorea, and rheumatic fever. Through case studies, which I'm super excited to hear about, and the autoimmune brain panel, he'll explore with us the molecular mimicry, biomarker targets, and effective treatments that they're discovering over the last 15 years. Is that correct now? Correct that you,
14 years, yes, we've been business years.
yes. And I have to say, I have a who used the Cunningham panel, and it really helped me know that they could heal. It helped me understand that it wasn't a mental health issue, but something that was an infectious trigger. And it gave my doctors confidence to give treatment to my children. So I'm very grateful to have your time, and I'm grateful that you kept molecular biosciences open for so many years. I know it's a tremendous effort. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Diana. Can you see my slides now?
Yes.
All right. Well, I'm happy to share with you some information
Please.
and about this and all the hard work he's been doing and all of the patients and physicians and the clinicians he's helped over the years. And yeah, I think you were one of the first ones that ever really began this and as far as a nonprofit. And also,
Yeah.
you were very instrumental in helping us get started and getting the word out. So I appreciate all that you've done.
Thank you. You're a large part of our family happiness. So thank you.
So today, let me talk to you about what I call brain on fire, and it's been also in the movie that during neuropsychiatric symptoms, and some of you will probably know a lot about PANDAS and PANS, so I won't go into a lot, but I will talk about the medical model, and we'll talk about how infections affect the immune system and lead to disruption in the brain. So we're going to talk about the connection between the infections, the immune system, and the brain, and go through some case studies about treatment resolution using the autoimmune brain panel, which is formerly known as the Cunningham panel. So just a reminder, this is for informational purposes only, and it's not intended to be medical or healthcare advice for any specific problem, and not a substitute for professional advice from your qualified health provider. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to talk about briefly the current status of medical care for patients that suffer from neuropsychiatric disorders, and then address the question, can infections trigger neuropsychiatric disorders? And then why is it that certain infections trigger these immune-mediated neuropsychiatric disorders, such as PANDAS and PANS, and you may have heard of neurologic alignment. Even we'll put long COVID into this category. And then we'll go through some your doctor diagnosed these disorders and as a methodology to help identify and understand the underlying. So worldwide, to think that there's over 800 million individuals who suffer from some type of neurologic, psychiatric, and behavioral disorders. You know about the autism now that I don't know what the latest is, 1 in 20 something now. Of course, anxiety, eating, but what people don't, these disorders and many more are diagnosed by clinical symptoms, not by. So, for instance, if you have motor or vocal tics for more than 12 months, that's the definition of Tourette syndrome. Now, it has nothing to do with the underlying root or the etiology of this disorder. And this is the reason why treated for their symptoms. And about 20% to 60% of patients in these different categories that become labeled as treatment resistant because they're not responding to these psychotropic medications. So what is really going on here? Medical specialization is unintentionally making it difficult to treat these types of chronic complex disorders because psychology and psychiatry are separate from infectious diseases, separate from immunology, rheumatology, neurology. Whereas we do know that the body doesn't segment them in the sense that infectious diseases do affect our brain, as we'll talk about, and neurologic system, as well as the immunological and the inflammatory causes of these things. So it is important that cross-disciplinary and collaborative medical care be administered because it really can help and accelerate the diagnosis and the treatment of these disorders. So we have tested over 16,000 patients since we've been open clinically, and they've come from all over the US and 50 different countries. And just as an aside, we don't have a big company. We're really very small, and we don't have any salespeople. So they come to us typically after seeing 5 to 15 different providers, and somewhere between 3 to 7 years, and often spending between 20,000 to over 100,000 US dollars, and even more. And because, again, the segmentation of specialization, which has been a great asset for other types of conditions, but for these chronic conditions that are more complex, it has not. In fact, we have done and are ready to get closer to publishing a burden of care study. One of these, I just have a number of the comments of parents and patients who've written in some of these issues that they have experienced as a result of suffering from or taking care of patients and family members with autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders. So we know it's a devastating burden on the families, on the individuals, and even healthcare in general. So what is the standard of care for neuropsychiatric disorders and mental illnesses? And it does focus on treating symptoms. And for a good population of individuals, these are effective. Psychotropic drugs, antidepressant stimulants, mood alternating drugs are very effective for a population of patients. But there are also deleterious side effects and warnings, the black box warnings on many of these different medications. There's also psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, brain stimulation therapy, and usually one of the last resorts is institutionalization of these patients. So why was Molecular Biosciences founded? Well, we identified that patients were suffering from these neuropsychiatric and behavioral disorders that were not understood. And it was based on 20 years of research on strep in Sydenham, Chorea, at the University of Oklahoma in Dr. Cunningham, my co-founder's laboratory. And that led to the identification of these targets that I'll talk about, the research targets that became what we have been able to use and now call the Autoimmune Brain Panel. So there was a clinical study on children that had sudden onset of OCD and tics and neuropsychiatric disorders that were preceded by a strep infection. And these patients were recruited, they got tested and recovered, and the clinical study ended. But then they shared this information with other family members and other colleagues and parents, and calls kept coming in for over a year wanting to be included in this study. And one of the parents said, "We watch hopelessly as our dear children lose chunks of their childhood to something so few currently understand." And that's when Dr. Cunningham came to me and we discussed this. And I decided that the most effective way would be to build a company, create a company, and be able to then have a clinical laboratory that was able to offer this panel and grow to be able to do other research that could help identify the underlying root of this disorder. So let's go to the question, can infections trigger immune-mediated neuropsychiatric disorders? It's one of the things that often for people who are not familiar with, let's say, PANS, PANDAS, or any of these other infection-triggered disorders, don't know and don't understand really how is that connection actually occurring. So JAMA Psychiatry, one of the well-respected journals in psychiatry, in March of 2019, published a study that was done in Denmark of over 1 million individuals who were followed from birth to age 18 years old, and they can do that in Denmark because medical records there are available to do that. What they found was that if a patient was hospitalized for a severe infection, that the risk of developing mental disorders increased by more than 80% for the diagnosis of schizophrenia, autism, OCD, ADD, ADHD, personality behavioral disorders, oppositional defiant disorder, tic disorders, and many others. And the editorial that accompanied this article asked the question, how could exposure to infections affect the brain mechanistically and give rise to mental disorders? They said circulating autoantibodies that enter the brain via a compromised blood-brain barrier bind to neurotransmitter receptors is a potential explanation, and this has been proposed in PANDAS and other mental disorders. So we do know and understand that a large portion of these disorders are caused by an infection-triggered autoimmune dysfunction. So let's kind of take a step back and think, well, how does this occur biologically? Because everybody gets exposed to bacteria, virus, fungal infections, and our body does what it should do, and that it begins to protect us by producing antibodies to recognize these infectious organisms. And this is where it begins to go awry. And in certain individuals, the antibodies that they make are cross-reactive with neurologic receptors in a process what we know as molecular mimicry. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And then they cross the blood-brain barrier, I was mentioned in the article, and disrupt normal brain function in an area of the brain called the basal ganglia. So we can kind of think of this as friendly fire in the wartime, where you can't tell the good troops from the bad troops. And then these antibodies go on the attack, and patients will begin to exhibit these symptoms that are described in many of these cases and case studies. And then they will be placed on symptomatic treatments, of which these individuals don't respond. In fact, many of these treatments actually do make these patients even worse. But when they are placed on immune modulators, anti-infectives, and anti-inflammatory agents, what you'll see is often these really remarkable recoveries. So let's look a little bit more into history and say, okay, brain-reactive autoantibodies are not new. They've actually been known for a long time in medicine, and you can see the discovery of these. So GAD65, if you know about Celine Dion's stiff person syndrome issue, it's autoantibodies directed against a portion of the brain that has this receptor. The NMDAR receptor is where Susanna Callahan and their Brain on Fire here in this book and this movie that was made about Brain on Fire, because suddenly she went from being a normal, healthy young adult into what they thought she had: psychosis, paranoia, hallucinations, etc. And an astute physician identified this as this anti-NMDAR receptor encephalitis, which is an antibody that was triggered by an infection that attacks the brain. So let's summarize this. There's a complex but direct interconnection between infectious and even non-infectious triggers and the brain, or the immune system rather, through autoantibodies, inflammation, microglia, all the immune system components, and the brain, leading to these various neurologic psychiatric symptoms, but in the context of a genetic predisposition, which we'll talk about for immune dysfunction. So let's move over to PANDAS and PANS, which you're probably very familiar with or you know of or heard of. And again, PANDAS stands for Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorder associated with a Streptococcal infection. And we're very appreciative of Dr. Susan Sweeto, who pioneered the understanding of this, but also brought a recognition to it because patients had been suffering from this prior to that. But in the 1990s, she studied groups of children who had this sudden onset of obsessive-compulsive disorder that was triggered by a strep infection. And that was published there in the first 50 cases. So it resulted in a diagnostic criteria, and it was estimated that 1 out of 150 to 1 out of 200 children have PANDAS, PANS, and the diagnostic criteria is listed for both PANDAS and PANS there, and I won't take the time to go through it because you'll be familiar with it. But what things people need to realize is that autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders triggered by an infection is not new. In fact, Sydenham, Chorea, was described back in the 1600s. Of course, it was credited as Thomas Sydenham, who described what he called Chorea minor. But it was even known before that as St. Vitus's dance, because these abnormal movements and the loss of fine motor control in these children and including, notice the loss of emotional control. And then even later in the 1800s or the late 1800s, Sir William Osler described what he called these bizarre and percipitive behaviors in children with Chorea minor and OCD and Sydenham Chorea. Well, we do know that the causative agent of rheumatic fever is group A streptococci, but Sydenham Chorea is also the neurologic manifestation of acute rheumatic fever, and it is also a result of group A streptococcal infections. And it does attack parts of the brain and attack parts of the heart. And so we do know that the basal ganglia, which is a part of the brain which is responsible for is one. And I took the time here to take a look at it. If you take the PANS criteria and you look at the criteria anxiety, emotional ability, irritability, aggression, or oppositional defiant behavior, these are emotional functions that are there in the basal ganglia. The behavioral regression, deterioration in school performance, they are a function of interfering with cognitive functions and procedural learning. You look at sensory or motor abnormalities, basal ganglia is responsible for voluntary motor control and somatic signs and symptoms of sleep disturbances, enuresis, and other things, as well as symptoms that can't be explained by other neurological disorders of the normal biological function of the basal ganglia. So I won't take the time to go through and show the data on the targeting of these antibodies to the basal ganglia, but that's clearly evident and published in literature. So let's talk about the nomenclature of these infection-triggered autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders. So, of course, PANDAS refers to the strep infection, but we also know there are other organisms that trigger this: Lyme, Mycoplasma, Babesia, Bartonella, many others. And it's believed that there are other environmental and biological factors. We have both infectious and non-infectious triggers, but PANDAS only refers to strep. So this is why the term PANS came about, because PANS refers to pediatric acute-onset neuropsychiatric syndromes, which does not refer to strep or does not refer to any organism, but is also a result of any microbe and potentially any non-infectious trigger. However, the P still refers to pediatric. So if you are not a child or an adolescent, you can't have PANDAS or you can't have PANS, even though you may be suffering from the same symptoms. So ANDL is another term that has come out. There's many, many other ones. adult autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorder associated with Lyme. But if you look at these a little bit broader, basically they're an autoimmune encephalopathy or an autoimmune encephalitis secondary to an infection, or a basal ganglia encephalitis, and you've seen that term maybe used. But really what we're looking at functionally, regardless if you're a child, an adult, or if it's strep, or it's not strep, or if it's Lyme, it's an immune dysfunction that results in neuropsychiatric and behavioral disorders triggered by an infection. So just remember this, because sometimes there is categorized things that are categorized that make it difficult to be able to obtain treatment, but recognizing it may not necessarily be the issue with what is actually going on. It happens to be with the diagnosis. And of course, then, this is the challenge for clinicians and patients who are experiencing these autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders secondary to infections. So let's change our attention to why do certain infections trigger these immune-mediated neuropsychiatric disorders such as PANDAS, PANS. I'll throw in neurologic Lyme and even long COVID. So why is it that only certain ones are capable of doing this? Well, there's a list here of bad actors that typically show up in patients who have these infection-triggered autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders, and on top of it is group A streptococci, and the hallmark of PANDAS, influenza A. Even in Dr. Sweeto's study, there were patients that were triggered and had influenza and had other different infections, but she chose to study the group that had streptococci and strep infections prior to that. Varicella, Mycoplasma, Lyme, or Borrelia, Babesia, Bartonella, Coxsackie virus, and even more recently, SARS-CoV-2. If we look at really during the pandemic, strep throat cases dramatically dropped during the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can see that here in this image here. I'm going to show this almost completely disappeared. So strep throat was gone for quite a while. And then you can see the resurgent here once the pandemic was over. And it jumped up to 30% from 2017 after the pandemic dropped. The other thing that occurred was in England, group A streptococcal infections triggering scarlet fever. Now, scarlet fever is something you didn't see a lot of, but again, during this period of time when people were not out and about and spreading things around, but they were also, these organisms had different opportunities to or mutate or have and hibernate until there was a resurgence and different infections that would occur. So thinking about why these particular infections are the ones that are the causative agents, we'll have to talk about molecular mimicry. So molecular mimicry is a term that's used, and it's the reason I call the company Molecular Biosciences, because our focus is on how these infections can actually trigger the immune system to be able to make antibodies attacking different parts of the body. So molecular mimicry is just a process that occurs when antibodies are made against similar sequences between some type of foreign substance and something of your own cell. So you can see this in nature. We start with 20 letters of the protein alphabet that occurs in all of our proteins. Now, there's a few others that are non-natural and other modified, but these are really the letters of the protein alphabet. So when you compare a sequence to, let's say, a bacteria like strep, or the dopamine receptor in the brain, or maybe the lysoganglioside or tubulin, there will be some sequences where a string of letters or a string of this protein alphabet are actually very similar or even identical. Now, why doesn't everybody get PANDAS when they get the strep infection? Well, that's because our immune system has what's called tolerance, and it tells the body not to make them, and it actually clears them out through various organs, which we won't go through in this talk. But there's two mechanisms of central tolerance and peripheral tolerance, where the body actually tells these cells, B cells, to die. So if we look at this at a molecular level, let's say a bacteria, let's say strep and the M protein, the epitope on this is presented, and we make antibodies against multiple parts of these organisms, but let's just focus on this one, which is called an epitope. But if it's identical to another epitope that's on a neuronal cell, once that antibody is made, then it will cross-react. And so this is one of the mechanisms of the generating of autoimmune antibodies against different parts of our body. And we call that molecular mimicry. So we do know and see that there is molecular mimicry between group A streptococcal antigens, the M protein, the group A carbohydrate, and there's over 100 different M protein species in strep. But there is also a sequence homology between that and certain proteins in the heart valve. Hence, we get rheumatic fever from individuals who have strep infection but are also predisposed in some way. This also shows some sequence similarity to that and basal ganglia, which is why we will see Sydenham chorea in a portion of these patients. So long COVID is really a similar mechanism in that the effect of a virus is triggering the immune system to be directed against the brain, the heart, the lungs, the blood vessels, and other organs. And so again, it's an infection-triggered autoimmune condition attacking a certain part of the body. So if we look at this in maybe a military fashion, autoimmune disorders and molecular mimicry, again, thinking of friendly fire, where we're actually destroying and attacking ourself. And this is most relevant with genetic factors in patients in the major histocompatibility complex and the HLA class 1 and class 2. And all you need to know about that is that these are the genes that help us discriminate self from non-self, which is why you typically can see in a high percentage of patients with PANS, PANDAS, or other autoimmune infection-triggered autoimmune disorders, you'll see a family history, not of neuropsychiatric disorders, but you'll see a family history of autoimmune dysfunction or autoimmune disorders or some type of an immune dysregulation. So practically, you might think of molecular mimicry as you just can't tell the difference between one component and another component, and this is just a little example of that. So let's go to some case studies on how the biological targets, what we call the autoimmune brain panel, can help you or your doctor diagnose and treat these conditions. So this is a published case study in the Journal of Neuroimmunology in which we had a dozen clinicians who sent us patients and supported, and we tested them before and after treatment. And I'm going to send that paper to you guys, or I'll send it you'll get it some way or another. And you can read this study because these are patients who have been tested before and after the treatment and followed up and found out those that did improve and those that did not improve. So I'm going to look at is the results of the pre-treatment results. Every one of these patients actually had one or more that were positive, and many of them that were very strongly positive. And again, a positive. In this group, you can read this group is where patients actually, after treatment, improved, and this was their results after they improved or completely got well. So you can see the dramatic difference between antibodies and the level of autoantibodies present in the patients that act. So we sensitivity of 88%, a specificity of 83%, an accuracy of 86%, and through some logistic regression analysis, we're able to get the sensitivity up to 88%, specificity to 90%, the accuracy to 90, specificity to 92, the accuracy. This is another published piece, but what you can see here, normal patients, and this is called the CAM kinase 2, I'll talk more about in a second. Normal patients are around 100. Oh, excuse me, my allergies are acting up. In patients, they will be elevated because it's one of the 5 autoantibody targets that the patient will see. What you can see here is these antibodies that will identify and bind or block different receptors triggering this. Excuse me. Another study that you can see here, because we're measuring serum autoantibodies, we wanted to find out if it correlates with cerebral spinal fluid antibodies. And the answer is yes, it did. In 94.3% of patients, there was direct correlation between what they had in their serum and what antibodies were in the cerebral spinal fluid. So we on for spinal fluid, this was a research study because you wouldn't want to be drawing that for a routine blood test, but it does show that they do cross the blood-brain barrier and they interfere with the receptors in the brain. So let's look at the targets in the brain panel and let's look at the symptoms that are associated with it. So one of the targets is looking for antibodies that are directed against dopamine D1, which is one of the 5 different dopaminergic receptors in the brain. Dopamine D1, when patients have autoantibodies directed against that, typically we will see psychiatric symptoms, mood swings, depression, anxiety, irritability, aggression, delusion, and even in some cases, psychosis. When patients have autoantibodies directed against dopamine, we'll see some type of movement disorder. They might have some choreiform movements, might have even there's typically some type of movement associated with that. When GM1, we'll see movements, complaints of joint connective tissue pain. And the 4th target we look at is tubulin. Tubulin is an intracellular protein that's highly concentrated in the brain. And when antibodies are directed against tubulin, we'll find that they will complain brain fog, other types of obsession, OCD, food phobia, and the CAM kinase activity is a complex to go into, but basically we incubate on patient's brain, but a continuous cell line, and we pulse chase them with radiolabeled P32 to see if the enzyme is activated by any antibody. And if it is, they'll have the numbers over 100 because 100 is baseline. And what we'll find associated with this is various types of sympathetic nervous system activation symptoms. So flow behavior, separate, start dry activities, etc. So these have been accumulated over 15,000 patients, which we've tested, and some data from Dr. Katz, who tested a lot of patients associated with Lyme and these immune-mediated neuropsychiatric disorders. So let me kind of wind up showing you a few case studies. This is an 8-year-old girl who had numerous psychiatric symptoms. In fact, she had an abrupt onset, vocal tics, poor concentration, emotional ability, and sleep disturbances and urinary issues. So they found out about us. We tested her. She had a antibodies against lysoganglioside GM1 and tubulin. Her course of illness was relapsing and remitting, and she complained of anxiety and OCD, and they diagnosed her with an unspecified disorder of the immune system. Her ASO happened to be non-remarkable, as well as the DNase-B, again, strep, looking at strep, and normal IgG titers. But strep can be in any orifice of the body, and what they found was that she did have 2 recent streptococcal infections with high fever, sore throat, sinus pain, and a history of frequent ear infections and sinus infections. So the patient's family was positive for mycoplasma infections. And again, they had autoimmune disorders and frequent bacterial and viral infections. And so this patient was treated with a single course of azithromycin with rapid improvement of symptoms, and all of her symptoms resolved, and you can see her antibodies return to baseline. I believe this is an important element of catching these early, because if you catch these early, the immune system doesn't have really a long enough time to be strengthened and making very strong memory B cell responses. So this individual, this child, was benefited by quickly being diagnosed and then being able to be treated with just an antibiotic. So this is a 17-year-old young man who had an abrupt onset of OCD. This individual had very similar symptoms, couldn't concentrate, sensory and motor abnormalities, of course, handwriting disturbances or dysgraphia, aggressiveness, choreiform movement, relapsing remitting, again, one of the sort of the PANDAS syndrome or symptoms, and acute sinusitis, and refused to go to school, which sometimes I don't think that's a telltale sign. That's probably something with a lot of kids. However, one positive, the calmodulin CAM kinase was very highly positive. And panic disorder, emotional disorders, again, indicating of sympathetic nervous system activation, and a personal history of traumatic brain injury. This patient had high Coxsackie, high parvovirus, high HHV6, hypogammaglobulinemia, Marfan's positive, and chronic sinusitis and frequent viral infections. One thing we find is that patients typically have more than, or I should say often, have more than one infection. And some of that is probably due to a triggering infection. And then when the immune system is dysfunctional, you become susceptible to more. Family history, as you can see, positive for rheumatic fever and autoimmune disorders. And so this patient was improved with nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory agents, and about 30% of patients typically can see an improvement. And then they were treated with multiple IVIG infusions, and the patient's symptoms resolved, and you can see the CAM kinase return to baseline. So another young girl, 16-year-old, this one had a restricted food intake and an OCD and tics. And this girl had an abrupt onset. And again, sometimes these are not abrupt, but again, remembering the abrupt onset is a criteria for PANDAS and PANS. And then this severe OCD or this food restriction. Now, this is different from anorexia, which is really more of an image dysmorphia, but this is really an OCD where you're fear of food contamination or a fear of choking versus really an image issue. And so, again, an OCD. This one was pretty significant because it prompted 6 calls to the police. So this patient also had one single positive, and it happened to be the CAM kinase. It was relapsing remitting, and the diagnosis was an autoimmune disease involving the immune system not otherwise specified. So when they looked, they found positive Western blot, elevated mycoplasma, the Lyme was positive, Coxsackie virus titers, and interesting, an autoimmune disorder in the family, and even the siblings in this case had PANDAS. So the treatment in this case was both plasmapheresis and IVIG with some significant symptom improvement. There was some low-dose Zoloft and Abilify to help, and the patient's autoantibodies returned to normal. So I'll wrap up with one more that's actually published by Dr. Bernstein. This was a patient who was diagnosed with schizophrenia, but was unsuccessfully treated for schizophrenia and psychosis. And she was in and out of treatment facilities. Dr. Bernstein's an immunologist. He was called in for this patient. He knew about her test. He ordered the panel. She had 4 positives out of the 5. And what he said in his article was, after 1 course of plasmapheresis, the patient had complete resolution of her psychotic OCD and anxiety. She was weaned off olanzapine and resumed her normal activities, playing tennis, 2 weeks after plasmapheresis, and it's been sustained for over 6 months. So I do that to show that it's important to get to a rapid diagnosis of the underlying root, because patients will present with similar symptoms, but the standard treatments for neuropsychiatric disorders are ineffective for 20 to 60% of patients. And this is where the autoimmune brain panel can aid in a diagnosis, because they can be separated from those that are immune mediated and would respond to these immunomodulators, anti-inflammatory and anti-infectives, and those that are not immune mediated, and those would respond to traditional psychotropic medications. The great news is that we have hundreds and hundreds of testimonies of patient stories, like Grace, who, believe it or not, she was diagnosed with a mental disorder at 8 years old because she wanted to kill herself. And the parents emptied her 401k twice with no answers. We tested her. She was positive. She was treated. And not too long ago, her mom sent us this picture of her completely well, back to normal life on the care team. And another of Adam, who was diagnosed with ADHD, and then they even thought he had autism, and they were considering institutionalizing him because they didn't know. And he happened to actually move to Oklahoma. They moved to Oklahoma, and they found out about us. We tested him. He was positive, and he was treated. And recently, his mom sent us this picture saying he's running cross-country. Recovery is possible. He's 10,000 times better. So the good news is that there's hope, but the important is to identify the underlying root and treat the root. So there's plenty of research articles and other studies that are available on our website. You can go to that and look at those if you need help with any of those. We certainly have support that we can. So let me summarize some of the commonalities here of patients that are positive with the autoimmune brain panel. We do typically see that they, if they are on, they are treatment resistant to the standard neuropsychiatric drugs. You often will see that they will have a frequent or multiple infections, but realize infections can also be subclinical, like the one case where the patient didn't have any signs of strep, but they did previously. And the other is they could have been diagnosed with Lyme or Lyme disease. And as you notice, there was some there with a history of autoimmune disorders. One of the others is the sudden or rapid onset of neuropsychiatric symptoms, but sometimes it's gradual. And OCD, sudden or rapid onset, or this restrictive eating disorder, which is, again, more of an OCD. Excuse me. Vocal or tic or reform movements, anxiety, rage, etc. Depression, dilated pupils, relapsing remitting. Excuse me. And suicidal ideation. One of our pediatric neurologists said that if you ask every one of their patients, that they will admit to having suicidal ideation. PANDAS and PANS, obviously. So how can you order the autoimmune brain panel? Well, it does require a healthcare provider to order the panel. However, we do have some helps. There's a test requisition that can be downloaded to take to your medical provider, or you can let your healthcare provider know that we can call them and share clinical evidence to them or provide an in-service, or let them know that also we're happy to share, like we're doing here, a webinar. So what is the process? Well, again, going to see your healthcare provider, blood collection, and then there is a $995 cost to it, but we do courtesy bill insurance. There's a $495 deposit, and FedEx is shipped to us overnight. It does take 2 to 3 weeks. I'll say that in the beginning, when it was taking 6 to 8 weeks, we're down to 2 to 3 weeks, and we're working to try to get it down to a week. So we'll test all 5 of these brain targets, and these are all manually high complexity tests done. And then the information will be uploaded into the healthcare provider LIS system. The report will be notified to the provider, and we will courtesy bill the patient's medical insurance. Typically, about half of our patients will get some type of reimbursement. Most often, parts of it, not because the insurance. But we also provide different types of payment plans and things like that. But the report then will go to the physician or the clinician, and they will provide the consultation, or we will support them. So let me kind of wrap this up with an overview of this diagnosis and treatment of neuropsychiatric disorders triggered by an infection. Important to identify and treat all the infections and rule out any other causes to establish a correct diagnosis. The need to treat the inflammation or the inflammatory pathway, and then treating any immune system dysregulation if the symptoms aren't gone. There also is a need to provide symptomatic relief as necessary, and you can think of this as treating the 3 I's. There's the infection, there's the inflammation, and there's the immune dysfunction. But often, if you to talk with your clinician about this, is that as you treat these infections, if there are multiple infections over time, there may be what the Herxheimer reactions from the die-off, or this other metabolic dysfunctions or gut dysbiosis that also needs to be treated in order for effectiveness in getting recovery. So this autoimmune brain panel is one of the first panels that we have released, and it's something that is we've tested now over 16,000 patients. We are clinically validating a panel of tests that we're calling autoimmune cardiovascular panel for immune-mediated myocarditis, cardiomyopathy, and heart failure and atrial fibrillation. And we are working on, as we can get continued grant and support for that, an early onset autoimmune Alzheimer's panel. As you might have heard, Alzheimer's is considered now to be an autoimmune condition or inflammatory condition that occurs many decades before even the first symptoms are shown. So in summary, we need to get to the root of these neuropsychiatric disorders in order to be able to get effective diagnosis and treatment. And so I'm going to leave you with, I adapted these 2 TAC laws from Dr. Sidney Baker. And the first TAC law is, if you're sitting on a TAC, the treatment is not to Advil every 3 to 4 hours. The treatment for TAC sitting is TAC removal, or in other words, look for the root and treat the cause rather than the symptoms. And then TAC law number 2, if you're sitting on 2 TACs, removing 1 TAC does not eliminate 50% of the symptoms. So you need to realize that complex conditions are complex, and to be effective, you need to address all the underlying issues, meaning infection, inflammation, the immune system, metabolic condition that's impacted, gut dysbiosis, etc. So if you want more information, on our website, we have lots of information, videos, educational brochures at moleculara.com. Or you can call about questions about blood draw stations. Again, you can call our office, or questions about insurance coverage and payments. So you can call our office. If you're a healthcare provider and you're listening to this, You can contact our medical relations at molecular.com, and we can provide in-services or support or review or test panel. And for those of who would like just some additional information about books and resources that are easy to read, there's the My Kid Is Not Crazy DVD. There's the Saving Sammy. There's many of these other Brain on Fire. Those are very helpful and those are informative for those that may not be familiar with what's going on in this area. And of course, the PANDAS network is a great source of information, help, and we partnered with them for over a decade now, Diana. And we're always happy to help in any way that we can. So I'm going to
Thank
pause
you.
and take
This
any.
was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much, Craig. Um, are there any other questions while I'm speaking with Craig? I'm going to ask him a few questions. Just one sec. Can you just do it so that just the two of us are visible, please? Okay. At any rate, Craig, I wanted to ask about the CAM kinase. A lot of kids are positive for that, and maybe they've been sick longer or the illness is waning and the other markers are less pronounced. Why does that happen?
Yeah, it appears, again, these are metabolic markers, meaning that they're present at the time of these symptoms, just like your blood pressure changes over time and your different uh, blood sugar and things. It's a metabolic test. What we typically see, and it's not really a test for infections, but when the CAM kinase is positive, we typically see a undiagnosed infection and or a recurrent infection. And it seems to be stimulating that early on. And as time goes on, it seems like these antibodies begin to develop with these other targets. So we do recommend that if we see a positive CAM, that to look for an undiagnosed infection. Now, again, this is not a test for an infection. It's a test to show that there's an autoantibody that's stimulating the sympathetic nervous system. But we do find that there's a correlation. And so there's a development over time. And sometimes, occasionally, we have patients with all five of them positive. Sometimes we'll have them with no CAM positive and the others, but it depends on their symptoms and the duration as to which they're there, which is why we have to run all five of them because we want to be sure to pick up any patient.
Mhm. And I think one of the reasons I love the test so much is that I was able to see with my son. So it's in 2008, I guess. We were one of the first, you know, experimenting with him. But I was so afraid because he was so acute, and the numbers showed that. And as he healed, every 3 months I would test and or so, and I could see that just as you stated in those wonderful charts, that all of the dopamine receptors and the other targets diminished and diminished over time, and he was healed. And then we checked a couple of times just to make sure the brain was still sealed up, and he continued to remain well. So
Yeah, it's
one
your
of the
son.
reasons I really like it.
That's a great story of your son, too. I know he's doing really well and get to college and out and
Yep,
great.
yep, yep. Somebody's asking here, how often do companies does commercial insurance cover the panel?
Yeah, about half of the time they cover some of it. Sometimes the insurance will cover all of it. And so we generally will then cut checks back to people for the difference between that. We do bill under existing CPT codes as a courtesy. We are working to try to get into network because we are out of network, but insurance companies have not been really very friendly about letting us get into network. So we're working on that, but it's about half the time we will get some coverage. And again, I mentioned we do have some payment ability and things like that because we do know that it is a fair amount of money, and we want to be sure that people can be able to take it as they need it.
Right. Yeah, and people can call Pandas Network we can sometimes help people with some of the cost because we just think it's such a wonderful, exciting test, and you don't have to do a spinal tap.
Yes, and we've been gracious to help support those that are in need.
A
So
little bit, but yeah, people can let me know, and we'll do our best. A mommy had asked, let me see, my child has been sick for 10 years. Would it be helpful for someone sick a long time? My 2 cents is I think so, yes.
you're
But
right. And we do have some that have been over a decade because they just have not been finding answers, and they just believe and know that there's something that is not right and they're not getting the right answer. So it is one of those things that could be a possibility. And it's not necessarily duration because we've actually have some that are closer to even 20 years.
yeah, but
Amazing.
give it a
Yeah,
the
can't
other thing
imagine.
that you guys don't put on your website, but I might say this wrong, but you use actual brain neurons, cell lines from cadaver. I mean, it's scientific. It's not from someone who just passed away recently, but it's scientifically harvested brain neurons that are then, we can replicate um, the possible attack on real human brain through this wonderful scientific process.
You're right. This is why and this is the CAM kinase you're referring to.
Yeah.
We grow up these human neuronal cells, and it takes a long time and costly, and then we incubate the serum on them to be able to see, and we have to have a radioisotope license to be able to pulse chase them to see if there is activity going on. So it is lengthy and a very
It's
very complicated process.
Yeah, it's not just a blood test. And the last thing I'll just mention that what I find so exciting about neuroscience, and you guys turned me on to this, is that, where technology uh, is moving to the point, and scientists are moving to the point with Alzheimer's and Parkinson research, that we can, through stem cells, generate human neurons, to then advance science even more and more and more. And you guys are one of the first people to pioneer this stuff.
Yes,
It's
that's right.
real neuron stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody's asking, where is Dr. Bernstein? Is this Gail Bernstein that did that report?
No, Dr. Bernstein is at the Cincinnati Children's Hospital or in that locale.
Hmm. Do you know the first? I don't know the first name.
Forget his name, but
Oh, it's
John.
I know who it is. They can contact me. Whoever it is, you can email me, Diana@pandasnetwork.org, and I just can't think of his name, but he's a really good guy. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, immunologist there at Cincinnati Children's.
Right, right. How successful are you finding to get immunoglobulin treatments covered if appropriate? Now, you don't give immunoglobulin treatments, but what do you find nationally the struggle is with IVIG?
A really interesting question because we have partnered with some uh, infusion services groups who, because of the test being positive, have been able to use that to get coverage for IVIG. And as you know, it's challenging to get that, but there are several physicians, clinicians who routinely are able to do that with the test results. So it does support it, it does help it, and it is one of those biological evidences that you can provide. There certainly are a lot of other issues that sometimes you have to deal with, and sometimes it's perseverance, but there are good groups that are able to help with that. And I'm sure we can share some of them if
Yeah, it's
people
it's team spirit. Everybody does help each other in this little group. Um,
are.
does Medicaid cover the panel? I don't think so. It does.
We don't actually, it's rare that we've ever had Medicaid patients. So we don't,
Huh,
and
I'm
uh,
surprised. There's a
yeah,
lot.
it is.
Oh,
And part of the reason that we don't even do that is because there's a requirement for federal insurance is that you have to bill a patient a certain number of times and you have to attempt to collect. And we just don't do that. We don't. So it's a it's you're supposed to be giving the federal government the lowest possible price and showing that you're doing this and attempting to do that. And then there are certain laws that are restrictive. So unfortunately, we don't have that coverage. So we've never actually had that come up, or I shouldn't say we've had an issue with that. Patients have ended up paying, or they've gone to, and we've had other support nonprofit groups who've sent us money to support people who.
Yeah, people should not be, do anybody on this call, don't be shy to ask PANDAS Network, we'll try to help. Um, the guy, Dr. Bernstein, is Jonathan Bernstein.
There
Thank
you
you,
go.
Mary, from Cincinnati. You can Google his name's immunologist, right?
Yeah, that's right.
We've just a few more questions. Based on the panel results, do you think IVIG and plasmapheresis is a good idea? If a
Um,
person has a positive negative result, does that mean they should do more than just an antibiotic?
yeah, so again, this without knowing more about the patient's history, there is evidence and good, as you saw in these case studies, that patients who have positive results do have good responses with that. Now, if you don't deal with the underlying infection with it,
Right.
often what you may see is a patient improve for a while and then it relapse. Because again, remembering there's multiple things to deal with. Conversely, sometimes we've seen individuals have the infection dealt with, they improve for a little while, but it doesn't completely go away until they deal with all of the infections or the immune system.
And
So,
also, if a child has humongous tonsils in particular and sinusitis and ear infections, go to the ENT. Really consider surgery and really looking at what's going on there. My son improved by like 50% with the tonsillectomy and adenoidectomy, but the tonsils were huge, so it was pretty obvious that it needed to
yeah.
happen.
So there is those instances too where you've tried everything and the patient still has these infections hidden in the tonsils. And Dr. John Harley is one of the TNA doctors who has shown and published evidence for PANS patients who have benefited from that. Again, it takes a little bit more of searching for what's going on, what was tried and what was not, and then finding, well, is there still maybe some infections still there that haven't been identified or treated, or is there some immune dysfunction that's going on, or is there some inflammatory component that needs to be addressed?
There's one more question I think is really good. My grandson, says Margaret, seems to be doing very well after two IVIGs and good diet, changes to the diet. Is there any benefit to him taking the autoimmune brain panel now that he's starting to heal?
Yes, I think again, and so this, I'll use Dr. Bernstein as an example. After I read his journal article, I called him and asked him, can we get a specimen to test afterwards? He said, well, they thought about it, but the patient was doing well. They didn't know why they would want to spend money to actually see that. I said, I agree, but we'll do it at no charge.
Oh, good.
And so we did it, and all of our antibodies were back to normal. And it's evidence that we like to have because we're trying to all demonstrate to the world that this is not something going on in somebody's head. This is a biological situation. So I would say if the grandson is doing well and there's no other concerns, then probably not necessary unless maybe he's only 85% well and there's something else still going on and you're considering some other types of treatment. But if he's doing
As
great, that's
as a
good.
parent, the peace of mind of Craig, the peace of mind of seeing everything all clear is like, okay, we can go on vacation for once in 5 years. It's a really good feeling.
That's true. That's a peace of mind then.
And one last question, if you don't mind. Somebody's asking, um, can you or Molecular help guide treatment through the process if a local physician is needed? And I was just going to say, I would think that if Molecular was contacted, some good research studies that the parents could hand to them would would be there. Um, but I don't think you speak to doctors. I'm not sure if you can help guide treatment or recommendations.
I would say we do have nurses on staff, and we do have, and we spend a lot of time working with doctors who want to know about how to treat them. Technically, we don't give any kind of medical advice, but we do provide support, and we also provide research and clinical evidence of certain things that were being used and help. But again, right, we are not a medical provider in that sense, but we are a little different, a lot different, I guess, than maybe your LabCorp or Quest, in that we spend a lot of time helping practitioners through that process because we need more practitioners actually treating patients.
And I wanted to tell you, Craig, too, because of the panel, Dr. Bejero, Suzanne Bejero of Sweden, is now doing a schizophrenia study. I don't know if did you know that?
I heard about that, and that's good. That's good.
Yeah, and so I mean, opening minds, opening hearts, and we need this test available all over the world. That is my prayer.
Mhm. Ours,
So,
and I appreciate your help because I tell people we're nonprofit, but not on purpose. It's just because the test doesn't cover all our costs. So I go out and I raise money, and we have a lot of our supporters, investors, and things like that, to hopefully that one day it'll cover everything we need and allow us to keep doing our research. So we write also some grants, and then but our goal here is to make a difference and impact in how medicine is practiced for these patients. So we're here to help, and we know that you have been, and you've been a great help to us. And I think we just need the world to understand and know that these are treatable, and you need to first get a diagnosis that's correct, and then work on getting the appropriate treatment. And these patients get remarkably well.
sorry, one more question somebody asked. How long after IVIG should she get the test? You know,
Yeah, that's a really
that's a complicated.
no, that's an important question. I'm glad somebody asked that because the half-life of IVIG is about 45 days. So what we don't want to be doing is testing somebody else's antibodies that are actually exogenously given to a patient.
Go through the IVIG.
Yes. And the other thing is we want to be testing we want to be testing the patient's situation outside of the interference from that. So we recommend 6 to 8 weeks post IVIG when that will be at least cleared down enough. Because you can imagine if IVIG is collected from over 1,000 patients, it's not unlikely that some of those patients may have PANS, PANDAS, or some of these autoantibodies or infection-triggered autoimmune conditions. And they're not endogenous, meaning they're not produced by their own B cells, so they'll go away eventually. But we don't want that interference, or that we don't want that misdirection of identifying that when that's not the case. So 6 to 8 weeks at least. Longer is good, but at least 6 to 8 weeks.
Or yeah, 3 months. I always think trimester. The baby grows every 3 months. That's
Sure.
my baby. All right. Thank you so much for having this lecture. I will be sending it to everybody. There's actually a few hundred people who inquired about this lecture. I'll be sending the paper that you mentioned and the live video next week. It'll be recorded, and we'll also permanently have this on YouTube. So thank
Okay.
you so much, Craig, for your time.
Thank you,
And
Dad.
thank you, everybody else, for attending. We'll have some more webinars to come this summer.
Okay. Bye
Thank
now.
you. Bye-bye.